This is The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 Retribution. Now, if some of you may remember, we did do a review of The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Retribution Chapter 2 back in November for the Quest 2, and we had a lot of issues with it. Now, we have our hands on the PSVR 2 and PCVR versions, so stick around and we're going to break them both down for you guys and see what has changed and what version reigns supreme. Hey guys, it's Chris from the VR Grid, and welcome to our comprehensive review of the PSVR 2 and PCR versions of The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 Retribution. Now, just a quick few notes. We spent most of our time playing through on the PSVR 2 version, so it is the PSVR 2 footage you will primarily see here. Spoiler alert, the PSVR 2 version is actually the better looking version, but trust me, we're going to get into that way more later on in the review. However, for a visual deep dive on the visual differences between the PSVR 2 and PCVR versions, make sure to check out our side-by-side comparison video that should be on the channel soon. Also, yes, there is a PSVR 1 version planned, with both a physical and digital version being released, but the only release date we have is sometime in 2023. Anyway, with that bit of info out of the way, please hit that like button, guys, if you would be so generous, as it really helps out the channel. And yes, consider subscribing to the VR Grid if you like what we do and you want to see more. Now, kicking our review off, I want to get into some story, but before I do, let me just preface this with the fact that Retribution, while a standalone game, really does expect that you've completed the first game. While the game does recap a few of the major events from the last game, this is very much a continuation of that story, and the sequel's narrative and gameplay jumps right off of that. So, spoiler alert, upon the fate of the coveted reserve from the first, you now find yourself hunted by a new, seemingly unstoppable threat, a looming, armored juggernaut out for your blood. Meanwhile, the Tower, New Orleans' authoritarian powerhouse, has a new scheme to secure utter dominance over the region, and of course, it has you in its crosshairs. Now, I can't say that I found the first game's narrative to be much more than a reason to play the game, and I felt the same here in Retribution. Bouncing around New Orleans as everyone's errand boy remains the same here in the sequel, meeting a host of new key characters that will help to flesh out the game's narrative. Now, while I don't feel that story or character development has ever been a strong point of the series, however, I will say that this time around Skydance Interactive has done a much better job of developing real antagonists to our character, instead of the way the first game just kind of put us in the way of ongoing events. The tourist actions from the first game have made him some enemies, so it's nice to see that play out here in the sequel. Moving on to gameplay, I'm going to assume that if you're watching this, you have played the first Saints and Sinners. Now, if you haven't, I strongly recommend that you go back, watch our complete review for the first game, play that, then come back. So for you Saints and Sinners veterans, gameplay-wise, you're going to feel right at home here, as jumping into Retribution and its 10 to 12 hour campaign just feels like the next day in Saints and Sinners. Now, I don't really mean that as a negative, as the first title was polished as hell, and to this day is still one of the gold standards for a full locomotion VR action title. But the developers definitely went with a if it ain't broke mentality here, and played things a bit safe. Starting up a new game, you were given the option of either importing your save from the first game, giving you the benefit of starting with the gear and recipes you attained in the first game, or starting over here in Retribution. Though starting over in Retribution doesn't mean you're starting from scratch, as the streets of New Orleans in Retribution are much more dangerous here, with increased zombie numbers and enemy NPC factions. Not to mention the inclusion of night missions, but more on that in a bit. As such, players starting out fresh will see that the old crafting tables have been leveled up a bit already. In addition, your armory in the bus is stocked up with some higher end toys, and your new base of operations down in the catacombs is filled with junk to recycle. Also, you can hit the first mission in fighting form and not swinging spoons and frying pans. Now, I gotta say, I was a little torn starting off so well prepared, as the survival fan of me really didn't like this, as half the fun of the first game for me was that rag to riches progression. That being said, I also do like kicking ass. Anyway, regardless of what side you land on in this, increased zombie count and faction NPC altercations early on does burn through some of that early buffer that you start with. So for those like myself that are not super stealthy, you will quickly find yourself back to scavenging in order to survive. The addition of 2 crafting tables is where players will find all the new toys and perks added here in Retribution, opening a whole new reason to scavenge. New weapons range from an Uzi and sawed-off shotgun to more heavy weapons like the chainsaw and grenade launcher. In addition, weapons can now be modified with such add-ons as silencers and laser sights. And while most of the toys are on the one crafting table, the second table is devoted to more character buffs, such as the much appreciated increased stamina, various combat gloves, as well as further buffs to combat resilience. So essentially, more of what we got in the first game, making you an even bigger badass. Along with this also comes a few new ingredients to keep an eye out for, most notably of which what the game calls phosphorus, an ingredient found predominantly in items scrounged at night and highlighted by the flashlight's new ultraviolet mode. Phosphorus is the key ingredient for crafting at these two new tables, and as such, night missions become the predominant new feature here in the sequel, not just for crafting, but in the game's mission structure as well, not only making many missions playable only at night, but going as far to include an entire side mission hustle to the game based around these night raids. These set of side missions introduce a trading network led by a contact known as the Pawn King. Once introduced to you, a section in your notepad opens up, listing each of the game's areas and 3 possible retrieval missions you can take on at night, providing you can find the contract in each map. And traveling at night, whether on a Pawn King side mission or on one of the game's story missions, is definitely where I found that Retribution was at its best, feeling a little more fresh and a little more dangerous than the first game. A higher zombie count and more aggressive zombies are par for the course at night, compounded by, of course, your reliance on staying in the shadows to remain undetected, while simultaneously relying heavily on your flashlight to navigate the dark streets and find more phosphorus. Night raids consequently also offer up the chance for better loot, coming often in the form of not only the aforementioned phosphorus ingredient, but also higher end weapons and other survivors' abandoned backpacks, which you can pillage. Now here's where gameplay wise we see the first big divergence from the Quest 2 version to both the PSVR 2 and PCVR versions, as the increase in zombie count, especially during these night raids, is like playing 2 different games. Whereas the Quest 2 version certainly did increase the zombie count, it was often a minor bump in zombies and often seemed to rely on cheap zombie spawns behind you in order to feel more threatening. However, the PSVR 2 and PC versions throw literal hordes at you, making for encounters that, if you aren't prepared for it, will turn you into Glenn faster than you can say baseball bat. And if you are prepared, let there be carnage. And yes guys, the PSVR 2 version is pound for pound right up there gameplay wise with the PC version. Back into the daylight, and Walking Dead Chapter 2 honestly feels more like Chapter 1.5. As of the 12 areas you visit, only 4 are new ones. Old areas like the Shallows, Rampart, Via Corolla, and the Ward all return, and while noticeably war-torn, are very familiar, feeling all the more familiar scrounging for mostly the same items. And seriously, what is it with all the barbecue lighters in New Orleans? The new areas are welcome though, and bring with them a bit more complexity and verticality, as most of them bring us into the more urban areas of New Orleans and eventually to the tower itself. Thankfully, while Retribution retreads many areas and ideas from the first game, like I had previously mentioned, it also ramps up the overall level of combat, making it more necessary than before to show up to areas ready to fight. And this is where the new crafting tables and the toys that come with them again help Retribution feel like something new. The chainsaw being a real standout, and honestly, almost reason enough to play the sequel, is all types of brutal fun, and see Saints and Sinners dip its toe into some of the deeper zombie carnage I wanted from the sequel. Thankfully, the PSVR 2 and PCVR versions have also made the chainsaw gameplay that much more enjoyable than the Quest version, as the chainsaw mutilations just about broke the Quest 2, and here on both the PSVR and PC, they feel much more at home, running smooth as butter. Unfortunately, the old Saints and Sinners game engine once again being used here seems to only be able to do so much, so don't expect any leg amputations or entrails spilling out. A disappointment to me, but I have issues. Now, like I said, much of what is here is more of the same, and while maybe not exciting to hear, it also isn't a bad thing, as I personally love the game loop and weighty methodical combat of the first game. Thankfully, much of the jank that plagued the Quest 2 version at launch, and to some extent still does, appears to be almost completely absent from these releases, with the PSVR 2 version coming off probably the most polished. With a few small exceptions here and there, the PSVR 2 and PCVR versions play like the polished game that I think we'd hoped for back in November with the Quest 2 release. Gone are any issues with invisible zombies and weapons that won't cut, both issues that drove us crazy in the initial launch version of the Quest 2. Additionally, the AI, while still not incredible, is no longer competing with the Aspire series for dumbest NPCs in a video game. The Quest version at launch saw human NPCs staring at walls and even running right past me at times, often making the zombies look more intelligent. Thankfully, most of that has been done away with, bringing it more in line with the first game at least. Finally, something specific to the PSVR 2 version is the inclusion of support for the DualSense motion controllers and head haptics. Definitely a welcomed inclusion here for PSVR 2 owners, as they certainly get the win here with weighted triggers, an improved tactile sense to handling objects with their hands, and a real wake-up call the first time they take a shot to the head from an NPC when the headset gives that little kick of haptics to the skull. That being said, it never hits the highs of the implementation found in Resident Evil 8 Village, never fully utilizing the HD haptics in the controllers or the head haptics, like I think they could have. Oh, and speaking of controllers, tracking here is good across the board, whether on PC or PSVR, though the usual occlusion issues did crop up from time to time when aiming with a gun or bow for the headsets using inside-out tracking like the Quest 2 or the PSVR 2. Again, on PCVR, mileage may vary here depending on what headset you're using. Now let's talk visuals, because here's where things get really interesting. Look, I get that people will say it's not fair to compare PCVR and now PSVR 2 to the Quest graphics-wise, and well, I actually don't agree with that. Here, I think it has to be addressed, as the Quest 2 version of Retribution was at launch, and to a significant degree, still is a bit of a visual mess, rife with texture pop-in, low-resolution textures, and a general lack of polish. I need to make it very clear that this is not these versions of Retribution. So, okay, enough about the Quest 2 version. Graphically, the PC and PSVR 2 versions are on a completely different level and feel like natural progressions from the PCVR version of the first Saints and Sinners, which is sure to be a significant and much appreciated upgrade for those coming from the PSVR 1 version of the first title as their reference point. I should also mention though that we do not have the PSVR 2 version of the first Saints and Sinners, so we're not going to talk about that in this review. Now, I say a natural progression from the PCVR version of the first game, as Retribution is fundamentally visually the same game as the first, retaining that same general art style of the first game, which pulled much more from the comic books or Telltale series of the games than the TV shows. The big difference here from the first game can be seen in an increase to the level of detail, both texture-wise and in the level design. The former being evidenced in the more interesting world design due to the continued dilapidation of New Orleans, as it has fallen into further disarray since the events of the first game. This continues inside buildings as well, as Retribution offers much more exploration of building interiors and definitely makes a concerted effort to make them more interesting and varied to explore. The previously mentioned night raids also offer the game additional visual variety, as they start out truly pitch black and will slowly move towards sunrise if you last long enough to see it. Making things even better here is the drastic increase in the brightness of the flashlight, a key complaint I had in the first game and an improvement that is very, very welcomed, especially considering the sequel focuses on said night missions. Additionally, the inclusion of flares, while also a cool gameplay addition, really show off the game's improved lighting effects, which just so happens to be the other big improvement seen here in Retribution running on the PSVR 2 and PCVR. Lighting effects have been much improved here in the sequel and can really impact the general feel of the game, as everything from improved reflections, god rays, and just an overall texturing to levels benefits from a much more sophisticated use of lighting here in Retribution, something which was almost completely absent, mind you, on the Quest 2 version, making it feel lifeless in comparison here. Now here's where things get interesting, and that, my friends, is that while the PCVR version looks great, it is not the best looking version here. Even running a 3080 on my PC, the highly optimized PSVR 2 version, pound for pound, is my preferred version. Now, Ryan will give you guys the deep dive side by side of the PSVR 2 and PCVR versions, probably throw the Quest in there as well, but jumping back and forth reveals some interesting differences. The PC version with everything set to ultra and super sampling set to 150%, yes, the PCVR version looks sharper, or does it? Close up, yes, zombies and weapons look sharper up close on the PC when set to these max settings, but further scrutiny reveals that the PSVR 2 version, that as far as I can tell, not even using dynamic foveated rendering, is actually a sharper image overall when actually looking out into the game world and looking around. This, when combined that the PSVR 2 version is running at a flawlessly smooth native FPS in the headset with zero reprojection, and the PSVR 2 version is a much better experience than the PC version. And this really says something about developers being able to optimize for a single set of specs. And I also have to say, Mira be damned, because the OLED display of the PSVR 2, when compared to the Quest 2's LCD display running the PCVR version, makes the Quest 2 look absolutely washed out when in the headset. Now, let me be clear, guys, I'm not saying this to fanboy out on the PSVR 2, and of course, depending on your PC specs and VR headset, again, mileage will vary, but I'm floored by the work that Skydance has put into the PSVR 2 version, and it definitely sets an example to developers looking to make premium VR, and considering the PCVR and PSVR 2 as a combined market to actually make a return on their investment. Now, on the audio side of things, everything seems to be on point here in the sequel, retaining the first game's level of quality and excellent use of 3D audio. Not to mention the ability to turn on your microphone so zombies can actually hear if you squeal like a little bitch. Now, I was a big fan of the first game's audio design, enjoying that nuanced music and loving the weight of combat, both melee and ranged. So more of the same here for me is good in my books, and shouldn't be too much of a surprise as most of the effects and music tracks are simply recycled here. But new voice actors brought in for new characters retain the same quality and tone from the first, and the chainsaw sounds about as gnarly as you would hope, so life is good. And that brings me to my final thoughts and review score. The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 Retribution, while a standalone title, is much less a sequel to the first game than it is a continuation. Jumping into Retribution is VR gaming comfort food to be sure, as it felt like just the next day in New Orleans, as I instantly fell right back into that familiar game loop, with enough new recipes, weapons, and areas to entice me to head back into the zombie apocalypse. A new story keeps things fresh, and the option of night missions along with a stronger focus on combat is also a welcome change, as it increases the game's difficulty without going too action heavy so as to change the tone of the gameplay entirely. I'll be honest, the Quest 2 version was often a chore to play, but playing the premium versions of the sequel here certainly breathes new life into this sequel, reminding me again why I love these games. In a surprise to myself and likely to the irritation of many PC VR players, the PSVR 2 version is the best version here. But honestly, both versions are very polished and certainly a return to form for the series after the rocky launch of the Quest 2 version. We at the VR Grid give Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 Retribution for the PCVR and PSVR 2 versions a 9 out of 10. I had fun venturing back into one of my favorite VR franchises, and more of a good thing is still a good thing. Anyways, guys, that's it from us. Let us know what you think of this review. If you're coming from the PC side, how do you feel about this? Please, guys, like this video if you want. Subscribe if you're not already. And of course, I will catch you on my next video.